Hey guys, if you take a look at our scale of what you guys hopefully will be able to do, talks about defining a problem, reviewing it, planning an experiment, gathering data, generate hypotheses, develop a conclusion. Hopefully you see where that's going. That is the scientific method. So we are today going to talk about the scientific method, everything that goes along with that. What I would like you to do is open up your science journals. At the top of a page, write down scientific method. This is stuff that I want you guys to have in your science journal in front of you. So as I go along, I want you guys to kind of take notes. Might be different because this is on a video instead of live in class, but I want you guys to take notes as we go through. So let's jump right in. Two words that oftentimes are confused with one another are observation and inference. All science, every piece of science that we can do is based on human observation, whether that's with our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, or touch, our five senses. If we use a tool like a microscope, it is basically to help us enhance one of those five senses. You guys can make an observation like, hey, the teacher is wearing a shirt with a turtle on it. You guys use your eyes to see that. Now, an inference is a possible explanation. Maybe the teacher likes turtles. So when you make an observation, you then try to figure out why that observation is happening. So an observation is something that you make with your five senses, an observation. And then an inference is a guess as to why that is going on. All right. So I'm going to give you guys some observations. Observation 1, you hear people screaming. Observation 2, you smell cotton candy, popcorn, and hamburgers. Observation 3, you see a lot of people. What's your inference? What is your possible explanation for what is going on? If I was to make an inference about after seeing those observations and hearing that observations and smelling that observation, I would say maybe I'm at a fair or a concert. So you can make an educated guess as to kind of what is going on in the world based on your observations. And when you do make that educated guess, we call it an inference. In our science journal, we're going to make some observations and inferences real quick. I'm going to show you 3 separate sections of a kind of a picture, almost like a comic book that has different panels. And I want you guys to make some observations and inferences as we go. So, picture number 1. I want you to take a look at what's going on in this orangish yellow rectangle. Just make 2 observations. 2 observations about what you see happening in that little rectangle. And then I want you to make an inference. What's a possible explanation as to what that would explain what's going on in that little window. I'm going to pause, let you guys write for a few seconds, and when you're done, unpause it. Now I'm going to show you guys a little bit more of what's going on, and I want you to make another observation. What is a third observation? Now that you have some new data, you've made more observations, you have more data to use. I want you to make that third observation and then make a new inference. What do you think is a new possible explanation of what's going on? All right, so pause it. I'm going to show you one more little tile, and I want you to make a 4th observation and another inference. So there's some more observation for you guys to do, for you to look at. I want you to write down what you are seeing, and then I want you to make a final inference. Hopefully you guys noticed that as more information was available to you, as you guys continued to make observations about this scenario, your inferences most likely changed. What you thought was happening in the first one, when you got more information, probably changed. And if you got more information even still, it probably changed yet again. That's an observation leading to an inference, a possible explanation as to what's going on. All right. Now, our scientific method, I think it's the most important invention that humans have ever made. And a lot of times it's split up into separate steps. And those steps are often the same, but sometimes they're a little bit different. We're going to go through probably the most common version of those steps. And you've probably heard some of them before. So step number 1, you have to come up with a problem that you want to solve. All right. You've got a question. How do I solve this? Step 2, you want to gather information. You want to gather some research. If I am curious about how volcanoes work, I'm not going to gather research about, I don't know, how long tomatoes grow. That doesn't make sense. I would want to know, okay, how can I measure a volcano? Where are volcanoes located? What do volcanoes do? How are they formed? So I want to get some research that is focused on the question that I have. So the first 2 steps, come up with a question that you can test, gather information. Once you've gathered some information, that's when you make your hypothesis. Now, another word for hypothesis is an educated guess. And the reason that it's an educated guess is because you've already done a little bit of research. You already have an idea of where this might go. You could be wrong, but it's not just a completely wild guess. There's a little bit of information in your brain already about what possibly could happen. So after researching, make your educated guess. In science, those guesses are called a hypothesis. Then you're going to perform an experiment. That's everybody's favorite part of science, is doing the experiments. Your experiment has to test your hypothesis. So if you're curious about volcanoes, don't do an experiment about bluebirds. It's not going to, you need to test volcanoes in order to get an answer to your question. As you're doing that test, that experiment, there are a couple words that I want you guys to write down and to know, because you're going to see them again, and every science class that you'll ever take is going to use them. They're very similar to one another, and a lot of people get them confused. So we have an independent variable and a dependent variable. An independent variable, that is the one thing that you guys, as the experimenter, can change. So I'm going to make up a random experiment. I want to know which type of fertilizer makes my grass grow the best. So I can change the type of fertilizer that I put on my grass. That's my independent variable. That's what I'm testing. Which one is the best? So I get like 3 different types, and I set up 3 little experiments, and I put type A on one piece of grass, type B on another, type C on another. So what I am changing between each one of those little experiments, that is the independent variable, because it doesn't depend on anything else. Your dependent variable is going to depend on your independent variable. What do I mean by that? Well, your dependent variable, that's what's going to change during your experiment. So that would be how tall the grass grows. And it depends on what type of fertilizer you give it. So the way that I have always remembered this, since like probably 5th grade, the independent variable is what I can change. The dependent variable is what I'm going to measure. I'm going to change the type of fertilizer, but I'm going to measure how tall the grass grows. So independent variable is what I change. Dependent variable is what I measure. It's something that a lot of people get mixed up, but it's important to know the difference. Let's look at an example. All right. Austin wants to know whether the amount of time that he spends studying affects his science test scores, since he got a 90% on the last exam without studying at all. He decides to study for increments of 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, and 240 minutes for the next 8 tests. All right. What would be the independent variable? Well, that is what he is changing in between each little experiment. And what he's changing is how long he studies for. So the independent variable would be the amount of time that he studies. What's the dependent variable? Well, what depends on the amount of time? That's how well he does. That's what he's measuring. So his test scores are going to be the dependent variable. There's one more word down there, and that is a control. A control is where you don't do anything you just let things happen naturally so that you can always compare it back. So in this case, it would be studying for 0 time. And if he studied for 0 time and he got a 90%, well, what if he studied for 20 minutes and got a 50%? Maybe it's better to not study. So the control is going to be what you don't do anything to. If you go back to where I had those 3 different plots of grass with the different types of fertilizer, my control, I would have a 4th plot of grass with no fertilizer at all. Because maybe that grew the best and the fertilizer killed the grass. But I wouldn't know that unless I had a plot of grass with no fertilizer on it. That's going to be my control. Constants are anything that stay the same. If you go back to my little experiment with the grass, I changed my independent variable, the type of fertilizer that I put on each little plot. I had to keep every other variable the same. I had to keep the amount of water, the temperature, the type of grass, the humidity, the amount of sun. Everything else has to be the same. Because if I had 2 different plots of grass and I had fertilizer A and fertilizer B, and I gave this one with fertilizer A a bunch of water and this one no water, this one didn't grow. Well, do I know if it's because of their fertilizer or because it doesn't have any water? I don't know. But if I gave it the same amount of water in both, then I know that the fertilizer is the reason that this one didn't grow. So you have to keep everything else the same. Otherwise, you can't tell what's causing that difference in your experiment. You can't tell what's causing your dependent variable to change. So these are 2 words. Both start with CON. Both are very similar. But a constant is something that you keep constant throughout all of your experiments. A control is something that you just leave by itself to happen naturally and automatically. The next step is, once you've got your experiment set up, you want to run your experiment, you want to record and analyze what's going on in your experiment. So as your experiment is happening, you're going to record things, and there's different ways that you can do that. The first one is what's known as quantitative data, where you're going to write down quantities. That would be how long something took, how much money did you get, your test scores, how tall did the grass grow, what is the temperature of the sun. If you can write down a number, it's going to be a quantity, a quantitative piece of data. Your qualitative data are types. So a name, this type of grass versus this type of grass. Or maybe you're measuring, you give somebody different amounts of money, you measure their mood. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they confused? Their amount of money is going to be a quantity, but their mood, that's going to be a quality. So that's qualitative. So if you have something to write down that is a quantity, it's quantitative data. If it is a quality of something like a color, that's going to be qualitative. You come up with a conclusion. Was your hypothesis correct? Yes, no. Most of the time, if your hypothesis is wrong, you end up learning more. Because if you think you know how something's going to go, and all of a sudden it doesn't do that, you're like, I wonder why that is. So a lot of times, the best experiments where you learn the most is where stuff goes completely weird and wrong, and your hypothesis ends up being completely incorrect. All right, so let's say you have 2 different types of grass, and N is nitrogen, which is basically fertilizer. If I have 2 different lines, that's 2 different experiments, what conclusion can you draw based on this? Well, if I add fertilizer versus if I just left it alone, my control. As time goes on, the one with fertilizer is going to grow taller, which means adding fertilizer helps grass grow. So this would be kind of explaining your results in the form of a chart. Number 7, you want to repeat the experiment. You want to do it over again so that you know that something just completely random wasn't affecting your outcome. You want to share your results with people so that other people can do your experiment to make sure that you did it correctly, to make sure that the conclusions that you drew were correct. So repeating the experiment is the last step. What's the difference between repetition and replication? Repetition is when you do it again. Replication is when somebody else does it again. So repetition, I'm going to do this experiment 3 times to make sure that everything goes well. Replication is when somebody else does it. The reason that they're very similar. And the reason that I'm showing you this is because these 2 words show up on EOCs and you need to know what the difference is. Now in your science journal, I would like you to make a T-chart. On one side, write independent variable. And on the other side, I want you to write dependent variable. And then I want you to number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We're going to go through some practice. These come from old science EOCs, old science final exams. So this is one of the type of questions that you could see when you get to the scientific method part of these exams. So let's start. I'm going to give you 12 different examples, and I want you to write down what you think the independent variable and the dependent variable is for each. Scenario number 1. One cow is fed a growth hormone and another cow is not. After a year, both of them are weighed. Now pause. Scenario number 2. Mosquito repellent is sprayed on one arm and the other arm is not sprayed. The number of mosquito bites is counted after 2 hours. What is the independent and what is the dependent variable? Scenario 3. Bob studies for a test and Jackie does not. After the test, they compare their scores. What is independent? What is dependent? Scenario 4. Use this data table to determine the variables, the independent and the dependent variable. Number 5. Cockroaches are exposed to the chemical dioxin. After 3 hours, 45 out of 100 cockroaches are dead. What are you changing? What are you counting? Scenario 6. Ants are placed in a tray that is shaped like a T. At the end of the T, the ants can go into either a darkened area or a light area. Students count how many ants end up in the dark side and how many end up on the light side. Michael put 100 red seeds, 100 brown seeds, and 100 yellow seeds in his bird feeder. He counted the number of seeds of each color that remained after 2 days. Letitia timed how fast apple slices turned brown after being dipped in different preservatives, such as lemon juice, fruit freshener, and lime soda. Use this graph to determine which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable. Just as a little heads up, whenever you see a graph, every single time you see a graph, the independent variable is always going to be on the x-axis. That's just how it works. The dependent variable is always going to be on the y-axis. Always. X-axis has the independent variable. Y-axis has the dependent variable. That will never change for history of science. That's just how things are recorded. Going back to this one. Which one's the independent? Which one's the dependent? Scenario number 10. New houses are sprayed on the outside with different types of insulating paint. After a year, researchers determine how much energy each house used. What's independent? What's dependent? 6 groups of rats are fed identical diets except for the amount of vitamin A that they receive. Each group gets a different amount of vitamin A. After 3 weeks on the diet, the rats are weighed to see if the amount of vitamin A received has affected their weight. Last one. Elizabeth tested how high 5 different brands of new tennis balls would bounce when dropped from a height of 2 meters. She dropped the ball so that they hit the same floor tile each time. There are your answers. Go through and see how many you got correct. The last thing that I've got for you guys, a little Ed puzzle where you go over the different steps of the scientific method using one of my favorite movies of all time, and that is Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail.